Would you like to read a story now, everybody?
Yes, I think we would.
Let us get you set up for the story.
So, we're going to do 3 chapters of Nine Goblins tonight, so now is your perfect chance to get a snack, get a drink, get yourself situated. If you need meds, please take them. If your pets need to be squared away, please square them away. Likewise, your partners. Save your games. All
Hide
that
your
good
wives,
stuff.
hide your children's.
All kinda.
Content warnings for the evening.
This one, you remember this book is by Ursula, right? Yeah, okay. Headline content warnings: death and dying, horror themes, mental health and trauma, violence. And
Please do check out the content warnings in full in advance if you feel you need it. This is a heavier chunk of the book, by all means, but even as Alistair gives a little bit of a recap, I think last week we all kind of felt this was coming.
And when we say death and dying, I would just like to remind you that that is not age discriminating.
Yeah, so please do make sure you check out the content warnings as you need to. If anybody needs to step away and ask for, kind of a heads up when things are over, just let us or the mods know, and we got you.
Of course something bad is about to happen. It's an Ursula book, we're about 2/3 of the way through.
Yeah, the other thing I would say is exactly what Eldred just says, which is if you would like, absolutely light and fluffy, Ursula also writes lovely fantasy romance novels, and those are an excellent alternative source of your Ursula fix.
They're a knight, and they kiss.
And then they kiss.
Pardon me.
Drama. The drama.
Drama. Okay. Nine Goblins by T. Kingfisher. Chapter 15. It was still the small hours of the morning. The barn was smothered in shadow and in the rather thick smell of goblin digestion. Someone was shaking her shoulder. Sergeant Nasilka opened one eye, saw the enemy standing over her, and threw herself sideways before it could bring the lantern crashing down on her head. She snatched up her club and lifted it, eyes glittering in the orange light. Said Sings to Trees. Oh! Right. She straightened up and climbed out the straw. Sorry, old Abbot. I quite understand. He stood... Oh, no, he's Welsh because he's speaking Gobbo, pardon me. I quite understand.
Content warning.
Accents. He stood back politely while she roused Blanchett, Algol, and Murray. Out of curiosity, are you often woken up that way? Once, night attack. The barn was warm, but the air coming through the door was cool and damp. She shrugged into her armour and broke his kneecaps. Oh, with me forehead. Goodness. They left the rest of the 19th behind.
What was that?
It's such a perfect...
Such Asriel energy. You've switched from Henry Cavill to Michael Sheen. It's lovely.
My. They left, thank you. They left the rest of the 19th behind, a symphony of snoring and gas in the dark barn. Oh, that just tickles me. It was going to smell like a feedlot in there by dawn. Sings to Trees didn't seem particularly bothered by the idea. They gathered in the kitchen. He handed around slices of toast and mugs of hot tea, which the goblins fell on gratefully. Murray wrapped his long fingers around the mug and inhaled the steam, his eyelids still at half-mast. Now, said Sings to Trees, checking through the contents of a pack, you said there were no people or no livestock there. Did you notice anything that there was that shouldn't have been? Well, there was Wiggles, said Algol, patting the kitten, who was asleep on his lap, but he was stuck in a drain pipe. It probably doesn't count. Anything else? The goblins looked at each other helplessly and shrugged. We're not exactly experts on human farmhouses, said Murray. We tend to see them rather briefly, and we usually have something else on our mind at the time. The elf nodded. Well, I didn't expect anything, but I figured I'd ask. Everyone done with their breakfast? More nods. The 19th was not big on conversation before noon. Guess we should get going then. Nasilka nodded. Blanchett, can you walk? I wouldn't ask, but I want Algol in charge here, and I'd rather have you along with us. This was almost true. Nasilka actually wanted the teddy bear, who seemed to have a good head on its stuffed shoulders. Blanchett tested the ankle. Much better, he said. The gunk helped. Shouldn't be a problem. Well, you let me know if it is. She nodded to Algol. You're in charge, Corporal. If anything happens, she realised she had absolutely nothing to say to fill that gap, so she stopped. Will do, Sarge. Here, Pet Wiggles for luck. Scourge of the night, Corporal. But he likes you. Nasilka relented and petted the kitten. She probably needed all the luck she could get. Algol saluted. Nasilka saluted back. Sings to Trees watched them with an unreadable expression. She wondered if he'd sent the pigeon to the Rangers, and how he explained what he'd heard about a strange wizard. They set out. It was still twilight under the trees. They left dark green tracks in grass turned silver with dew, even Sings to Trees. Nasilka was sneakingly really quite pleased by this. There were stories that elves could walk soundlessly in without a trace, and it was actually really nice to see that this one didn't. Fleabane the coyote kept pace with them for a few minutes, before peeling off on some canine errand of his own. The forest got deeper and darker, even as the sun came up. So the net result was that the quality of light didn't actually change that much. The ground stopped being grass and started being moss, and then stopped being moss and became nothing but slick, wet leaves. Everybody skidded a little on those, even the elf, and when you were that tall, whippy little branches tended to hit you in the face a lot more than when you were short. I feel you, buddy. It occurred to Nasilka that possibly the tales of elven slyness were much exaggerated. Or possibly Sings to Trees was just a really big klutz. Except for the fact that they moved much more quietly and didn't fall into any poison ivy, and one of them was really tall. It wasn't much different than marching through the woods had been a day earlier. And then Nasilka heard something. It sounded like someone talking, but it wasn't in a language she recognized, or was it? She could almost make out the words. Had to be nearby. She could almost hear it all. Was that one voice or two? What were they saying? The cadences were definitely speech. It wasn't an animal noise, and it wasn't a bird song, and if she could just get a little bit closer, it occurred to her, somewhat later, that she was hurrying through the woods now, trying to make out the words. She could hear the footfalls of the others behind her. Undoubtedly they could hear it too, but nobody was saying anything for fear of drowning out the words. What were they saying? She had to get a little bit closer, just a little bit, and she was sure she'd be able to make it out, and she was annoyed to find out that her panting was making it harder to make out the voice. Was she panting? Yeah, she was. She'd been running. She was still running, but now she'd have to get even closer because she was wheezing like a full-blown horse, and Blanchett was saying, Sarge, what is it, Sarge? And that was maddening because he was drowning out the voice, and couldn't he hear it? If she could only get close enough to make out what it was saying. Sings to Trees could hear it, she was sure, because he was out in front of her now. The path had gotten very narrow through steep dirt cliffs cut by tree roots, and it would have annoyed her that the elf was blocking her path, except that he was moving fast enough that she was having a hard time keeping up. Could he hear the voice? At least he panted more quietly than Murray, who was also wheezing, and Blanchett had fallen back. Probably he couldn't keep up with his hurt ankle, and the sounds of Sarge were fading behind them, and that was good because it wasn't drowning out the voice anymore, and the skeletal stag landed in the path directly in front of them with a warning clatter of bone. It sounded like the mother of all rattlesnakes. Sings to Trees stopped. Nasilka let out a cry of frustration, and Murray ploughed into the back of her. They sorted themselves out, wordlessly, practically dancing in place. We have to get past it, said Murray. I know that, said Sings to Trees, but it doesn't seem to want to let us. The stag lowered its magnificent white rack. Oh, we could backtrack, said Nasilka wretchedly. Backtracking would take them away from the voice and the conversation she was almost about to understand. No, said Murray. He wriggled past Nasilka, made a short charge at the deer, perhaps hoping to bluff it. The stag was not inclined to bluff. It swung its head sideways, and white bone cracked against Murray's chest, knocking him down. "Murray!" Murray rolled over and began crawling determinedly forward. Could he get between the stag's feet? Nasilka cursed the fact that there wasn't room for two of them. Singster-Tree's face twisted. "I don't want to hurt you," he pleaded with the stag. "I really, really don't. I helped your mate. Please, just let us pass." Another rattlesnake clatter. The stag danced in place, feet falling perilously close to Murray's head. There was a second warning rattle. Nasilka looked over her shoulder and saw a bone doe standing there, watching them with empty eye sockets. The voice continued to talk, a conversation that was probably about nothing, but it might be something fascinating. And anyway, she'd know in a minute if she could just get a little bit closer. And then it stopped. Singster-Trees, who'd been about to charge the deer completely barehanded, stopped with an expression of horror on his face and looked down at his hands. "Oh," he said. Oh no." Murray said, what in the name of the dead orc gods am I doing?" Nasilka, seeing bone deer hooves like lances around the head of her second in command, reached down and grabbed him by the ankles. She hauled. Murray was really heavy, but female goblins tended to be strong all out of proportion to their size. He left long furrows in the mud behind him. The bone deer stamped a hoof and nodded to Singster-Trees. Then it turned and reached the top of the narrow defile in a single leap. There was a second clack of bone, and the skeletal doe followed. "She's still a bit short on the front foot," said Singster-Trees vaguely. "I hope it's healing. Shouldn't be making jumps like that. Oh, God, so I was going to attack that poor creature." He put his face in his hands. "I suspect that poor creature would have torn you to shreds," said Nasilka dryly. "Murray, how are your ribs?" "Sore," said Murray. "It hit me, didn't it? I don't think it wanted to hurt me, though, whatever it was. I don't have any holes." He slid a finger under his leather breastplate and winced. "Nothing broken. Can have some fantastic bruises to show the recruits, though." "It was a Cervidian," said Singster-Trees. "They're attracted to magic. Saw it the other day. Can't believe I wanted to hurt it." Nasilka thumped him on the shoulder, which was pretty much the highest point she could reach. "Get over it, soldier," she snapped, forgetting he wasn't one of, her soldiers. "You didn't. That's the important thing. The most important thing, though, is what the hell was wrong with us?" They all stared at each other. "I heard a voice," said Murray uncertainly. "So did I." "Couldn't hear what he was saying," said Nasilka. "I almost could, but I thought if I could just get closer, It had to be right round here, It had to be right around here, didn't it?" Singster-Trees peered around the woods, puzzled. "I mean, we were really close, weren't we?" "I don't think we were," said Murray, slowly. "We've been running, haven't we? Blanchett couldn't keep up." "Oh, gods, Blanchett!" Nasilka spun around. "We have to go get him." "He'll be fine," said Murray. "The bear will take care of him." Singster-Trees looked at them as if they were insane, which they probably were, but Nasilka did feel a bit better. "How long were we running?" None of them knew. "At least a mile, I think," said Murray. "It's hard to tell because it's cold out and the terrain's all, twisty. But I don't think I usually get this sweaty over anything less." "Can't have been that close to the conversation for a whole mile," said Singster-Trees. Nasilka had already come to that conclusion, and a couple of others, that she did not like at all. Murray tugged on his ponytail. "It was magic, Sarge. Had to be." a voice that makes you want to get closer to it. That could explain why the farms were empty. They all left to get closer to the voice. Nasilka chewed on her lower lip. Maybe it worked on the animals too. Singster Trees looked around. I don't hear any birds, he said, but that could just as easily be the Ceridian. Got real quiet around my farm when they showed up. I think they're just too uncanny. Well, Nasilka rubbed the back of her neck. Options? Find the source, said Murray immediately. Find out what happened to the farmers, said Singster Trees. Nasilka sighed. Normally I'd say we should go back and report this, but I don't know who we'd report this to. I could send a pigeon to the rangers, said Singster Trees. How long would that take? It depends. A few hours at least, probably more. I didn't actually send the other one yet. It's dark, they won't fly. So I was going to wait until we get back. Although I'm surprised they're not investigating already, frankly. Nothing this big should be able to go down without them noticing. Unless they sent somebody to investigate and the voice got them too, said Murray. Singster Trees winced. All right, said Nasilka. She mostly wanted to run away screaming, but she was in command, and Singster Trees was a civilian, and thus should probably be protected as much as possible, and he really didn't seem to be much good at sneaking. Also, there was the small problem of the village being between them and Goblin Home, and the Grim Gods only knew how far the range on that magic extended. So here's what we'll do, right? We're going to go find Blanchett, then Singster Trees goes back to the farm, we'll scout the village. We should wear earplugs, volunteered Murray. I can rig something up. Don't know how well they'll work, but if it really is a sound, we should just be able to block it. Nasilka was getting ready for the inevitable argument. Singster Trees looked like he was about to argue, when there was a very welcome interruption. Sarge? Sarge? Blanchett! She turned and waved. A familiar teddy bear, atop an equally familiar helm, appeared over the top of the low cliff edging the road. There you are, Sarge. I didn't know why we were running, but the bear said you were somewhere around here. Can you get down here? Sure, give me a minute. The helm disappeared. And while we're asking questions, said Nasilka slowly, why wasn't Blanchett affected? Maybe the bear's immune, said Murray, and then when Nasilka stared at him, he replied, have you got a better answer, Sarge? She didn't. For any of it, apparently. All right, she said, make up your earplugs. I want to move out as soon as he gets here. Murray's my boy. That's all I will say.
Absolute MVP of this chapter.
I just love the deadpan on maybe the bear's immune. Chapter 16. Singster Trees did argue, but it seemed to Nasilka that it was more a matter of form. The encounter with the Ceridian had shaken him really badly, and what he really wanted was to get home and send a pigeon to the Rangers as quickly as possible. You don't have to go, he said. We could all go back. We'll let the Rangers handle it. The notion that someone higher up the chain of command would be more able to handle anything was so foreign to Nasilka that she couldn't really get her head around it. Could elves really be that different? Nah. Elves were elves, but the military was the military. There was something immutable about it. Orcs were pretty different from goblins too, but their military worked almost the exact same way, except that at the higher levels you were answerable to the priesthood, and nobody said anything nice about orcish gods. We'll investigate, said Nasilka. Whatever this is, it's between us and our way home. Singster Trees sighed. I'll come as far as the tree line then, he said. I promise I won't go after you, but if you get hurt, I'm... well, a veterinarian, but I've worked on goblins before. Nasilka wavered. If this is affecting animals too, she sighed. Fine, but you don't come after us, all right? If something goes bad and we're not back by nightfall, you go back to the farm and you tell Algol what's happened. Oh, gods above, don't let Algol get a case of the heroics. I promise, said Singster Trees. She eyed him warily, but he was a civilian, and another species, and she probably didn't have the authority to order him back to his farm. Also, it was hard to assume authority when you only came up to the bottom of somebody's ribcage. Blanchett scrambled down. Hey, shelves. Blanchett scrambled down to them before long, covered in leaf mould and mud, but none the worse for wear. Honestly, the mud improved his odour quite a bit. Sings to Trees checked his ankle again and pronounced it acceptable. Blanchett, said Murray, assembling earplugs out of moss and half an old candle. Did you hear the weird voice from earlier? Blanchett pushed a finger under his helmet to scratch. I guess, yeah. Some kind of mumbling, wasn't it? And you didn't feel any compulsion to go chase after it? Blanchett looked puzzled. A what? An overwhelming urge, you know. No. Murray gave it up as a bad job. He finished the earplugs and handed them around. This won't block all the sound, don't have the equipment, but if you start to hear something, if you almost sing, that should drown it out. Can I sing The Bird in the Bush? Asked Blanchett hopefully. Nasilka had a brief image of exactly how absurd the three of them would look, trying to sneak up on the enemy while singing dirty drinking songs, and wondered if it would be any better if they were singing martial tunes or just humming really loudly. Sing whatever you like, Blanchett. I'm not sure if they'll work even then, Murray said. Might not be a real sound. Do you understand? If it's magic, it could be something in our heads, as easily as anything else. Well, we'll have to hope then, said Nasilka. Blanchett, this is a direct order. If you hear the weird mumbling again, and Murray and I start running towards it, you are to stop Murray by any means necessary, even if you have to hit him on the back of the head and sit on him. That's ganking a superior officer, Sarge, said Blanchett. It's in a good cause, Blanchett, and that is an order. If the wizard gets me, you two go back home, pick up Sings to Trees here, go find alcohol. You can get court-martialed for ganking a superior officer, said Blanchett. I'm telling you, Blanchett, it's on my orders. Blanchett screwed up his face in the bare listening position. He says, if you're dead, it won't matter if it was on your orders. Nasilka pinched the bridge of her nose and prayed for patience. No less so because the bear was probably bloody right. But he also says to do it, finished Blanchett. So that's all right then, Sarge. As long as we're all in agreement, said Nasilka wearily, and shoved moss and wax into her ears. They left Blanchett un-earplugged, since he apparently wasn't affected, and also he flatly refused to wear them, unless the bear got a pair too. As the bear didn't really have much in the way of, well, ear canals, that just seemed like a waste of materials, so it just seemed easier that way. There was enough crude hand sign available in Glibber to be able to communicate simple orders, and Nasilka didn't feel like a complicated philosophical discussion at the moment anyway. Sings to Trees halted under the last trees, gazing out across the waving fields of the farmland. He frowned and said something, and then when Nasilka pulled out an earplug, he repeated himself. The melons haven't been harvested. That strip along the drainage ditch, they always grow melons. It's got the most moisture, but they all split on the ground and rotted. How long does it take for melons to go bad? Asked Murray, who had also removed an earplug. About 5 minutes sometimes, said Sings to Trees, but these should have been harvested a few days ago, I think. He frowned. Nasilka nodded. Well, that gives us more of a time frame. She reached up and patted the elf on the shoulder. Try to stay out of sight. Hopefully we'll be back before too long. They put in their earplugs, looked at each other awkwardly. Then Nasilka nodded sharply and signed. Move out. There was a main road, not far away. And a hedgerow running along one side of it. They stuck to it as closely as possible. It was taller than a goblin, and made Nasilka feel less exposed. Small birds hopped through it. Murray pointed to one, and Nasilka nodded. So it wasn't all the animals, then. That was something anyway. They crossed 3 fields, and were midway through the 4th when they found the dead body. Nasilka saw it first in the drainage ditch. Murray saw it first in the drainage ditch, pardon me. He stopped short, and Nasilka and Blanchett came up on either side of him and looked down and saw it too. It was a human child, very young. Nasilka couldn't do ages on humans at all, but it didn't look old enough to walk very well yet. It was laying in the bottom of the ditch, and its eyes were open, and flies buzzed around it. Nasilka's sigh sounded strange and muffled to herself with the moss in her ears. Blanchett looked as inscrutable as his teddy bear. It was the enemy, but it was awfully small. Fell in the ditch, couldn't get out again, she thought grimly, probably following the voice, not able to look where it was going. She wondered where it had come from. She glimpsed a farmhouse far across the field, on the other side of the road, through gaps in the hedgerow. But if it had come through there, had human adults come with it? Of course, an adult could just step out of the ditch. Murray caught her eye and gestured to the farmhouse, then to the child. Zilka turned her hands up and nodded, then shrugged. Probably, I don't know. Zilka gestured for them to move on. They couldn't take the time to bury the human, and anyway, humans usually burned their dead, didn't they? They certainly didn't have time for that, or the wood, and a column of smoke would announce their approach as clearly as a bagpipe call. They moved on. 2 fields over, they found a dead dog. It looked old and not healthy. There was a trail of broken cornstalks behind it. Crows had been at its eyes. Whatever it is doesn't affect crows, then. Shading her eyes, Nasilka could see the town on the horizon. She wondered how many corpses there would be between here and there. As it turned out, there were a lot. A horse with a broken leg had hauled itself an astonishingly long way and then fallen down, and by the torn-up ground it had apparently tried to crawl, which Nasilka couldn't even imagine. A dead pig had expired without a mark on it, leaving a drainage ditch full of piglets, who had probably died of starvation. The sheep were really bad. Nasilka had seen a lot of horrible things in battle, where the entire flock of sheep had apparently run into a fence and gotten their heads stuck between slats, and then had beaten themselves to death against the fence posts. Murray eyed them coolly, then turned to the sergeant and pulled an earplug loose. Nasilka followed suit, wincing. All domestic animals, he said, cats too, which I suppose aren't really domesticated, but nothing really wild, anyway. Whatever this is, it's not affecting deer or rabbits or wild birds, it's just the farm animals. And people, said Nasilka grimly. And people. They put their earplugs back in and kept moving, keeping low to the hedgerow. A flock of vultures had descended on a dead cow, which had smashed several fences, and then been trampled by the rest of the herd. There was another human, not far beyond it, who looked to also have been trampled by the cows. After that, the humans became more frequent, the bodies more densely packed. Sometimes they appeared to have crawled over each other. Nasilka stopped seeing them. It was just like a battlefield the day after, a deep silence that seemed only to deepen behind the buzz of the flies and the croaking of the carrion birds. They reached the farthest outlying building. It was a little house, and there was a dead man lying on the front walk. He was very old, and there was white hair around his temples. They were mostly abreast of him when he moved. It wasn't much, just a hand scrabbling at the packed dirt, but that was enough. They stopped. It was one thing not to bury bodies. It was another to pass up a wounded man. They gathered around him. Nasilka pulled out an earplug but held up a hand when Murray started to remove his. "Help me," the old human rasped in a dialect that Nasilka could understand, even if the accent was strange. "Help me, oh, please." She crouched down next to him. "What happened here?" she asked. His eyes were nearly closed and rimed with dried tears, but he cracked them open and squinted at her. Goblin, he asked weakly, you didn't do this to us. It didn't sound like a question. No, said Nasilka, we don't know what's happened either. She pulled a water bottle off her belt and gave him a drink, trickling the water between his cracked lips. Can you tell us anything? Goblins, he said, sounded almost wondering. Some kind of weapon? It wasn't us. She gave him a little more water and would have asked him more, but he sank into unconsciousness. She looked up at Murray helplessly. We'll come back for him if we can, said Murray, too loudly. I'll do that. We'll come back for him if we can, said Murray, too loudly, on account of the earplugs. We should keep moving, Sarge. Which was true, which Murray shouldn't have had to tell her. Movement in the shade, at least. She and Murray each took a side and carried him back inside the house. There was a pallet on the floor, not much of one, but it was better than the walkway. Right, let's move. Blanchett, if you hear anyone crying out, let us know. He nodded. She put her earplugs back in. There were cattle in the town square. Some of the humans had died when the cattle crushed them. It was a mess. It was just a horrible mess, which was a laughably ineffective word for the scene before them. At least if she thought of it as mess. She didn't have to think of it as people. Nasilka was glad Sings to Trees hadn't come. Or Algol. She didn't know if the elf could handle it. While she knew Algol had been on battlefields, at least everybody there had been trying to kill you back. There probably wasn't much point in sneaking, but they kept to the shadows and the corners of buildings anyway. Murray tapped her shoulder and she pulled the earplug loose again. Really, why was she bothering? The moss was coming unwrapped by now, and whispered, yes. 11 humans so far, he whispered back. Maybe more in the buildings, but I don't think too many. They all seem to be trying to get into the town. Where are they going? Murray leaned out from the shadow of the building and pointed. I guess that building there. They studied the building in question. Pointy, said Blanchett finally. It's a steeple, some kind of church, I think. In a town like this, probably the main meeting hall too. Oh, wrong one. It's a steeple, some kind of church, I think. In a town like this, it's probably the main meeting hall too. Alright, stay low. We're in enemy territory. Don't anybody forget it, said Nasilka. Murray looked around and said, how could we forget, Sarge? They skulked from the shadows of one building to another. Nasilka thought that one was probably a bar, judging from the smell of spilled beer and rotting sawdust. She crouched behind a rain barrel and looked over at the church. The bear doesn't like it, said Blanchett suddenly. Nasilka paused. Does the bear have any suggestions? She asked delicately. Blanchett conferred with the bear and said, he says not, just it feels like a trap, not for us maybe. It feels like a trap for everybody. Oh, I hate this, said Nasilka to no one in particular. Right, tell the bear I agree with him. If he has any thoughts, please tell me immediately. Will do, Sarge. They crept closer. The greatest concentration of the dead was at the end of the street, where the church sat in what had formerly been a village square. They were pressed right up against the walls of the church, close to the doors. They looked like they trampled each other, and then the cows had trampled them. In a couple of places there were 3 or 4 bodies piled together. The church had big wooden double doors. The worst concentration of bodies was around those doors, and what looked like most of a steer had beaten itself to death against one, blockading it with a half-ton of rotting meat. The other door was ajar. She and Murray exchanged glances. She had the fight to... Pardon me. Nasilka and Murray exchanged glances. Fuck. She and Murray exchanged glances. She had to fight the urge to meet the teddy bear's single button eye as well. Somebody moved those bodies away from the door, Murray hissed. Going in or coming out, that's the... Oh! She grabbed Murray's shoulder and yanked him back into the shadows. A small figure, taller than a goblin, but not so broad, came out of a building across the square. It wore a cloth over its head and a bright blue coat, and its arms were full of... groceries? Nasilka could make out the corner of a sack of flour and some jars of preserves. The goblins watched, hardly daring to breathe, as the figure looked around the square, then threaded its way nonchalantly through the bodies towards the open door. "Human," whispered Murray. "Sub-adult. Can't do the genders from here." "How can it even breathe?" asked Nasilka. The stench of the piled bodies was enough to knock her over, and she was 20 yards away and a goblin to boot. Maybe it's had time to get used to it. The figure stopped at the door, balanced a load of groceries on one hip, and pushed the door open with its free hand. One of the corpses shifted slightly when the door hit it, a limp arm flopping in the dust. The figure shoved the arm aside with its foot, caught the door with the edge of its shoulder, and stepped inside. The goblins sat in the shadow of the building. Nasilka crouched behind a water barrel on the edge of the street and stared at it. Nothing happened. "Maybe its parents are dead and it's just trying to eat until someone gets here to find it," she said without much conviction. "Uh-huh," said Murray. "The bear is pretty sure that's a load, Sarge," said Blanchett. She sighed. "Yeah, me too." The casual waiter moved the corpse aside with its foot. That screamed murderer and crazy person and do not touch. "Do you think it's a wizard?" "It almost have to be, wouldn't it? There could be a grown-up wizard in there doing the actual magic." Murray chewed at his lower lip. "Children are vicious little bastards. Some of them," offered Blanchett. Flies buzzed. Across the square, two crows got into a brief squabble over a tasty bit of carrion. "Now what do we do, Sarge? Do we go back?" Murray glanced behind them. Nasilka would have loved to go back. Going back sounded great. But if they went back and told Sings to Trees, he would insist on coming out to see if the human really was a child who needed help, and if his rangers showed up, they'd probably do the same, and if it was a goblin child, they'd be on their guard, but since it was a human, and humans were nice... There were already a whole lot of dead people out there, and Nasilka didn't care very much for faceless unknown rangers, particularly not elves, but Sings to Trees didn't deserve to wind up in that pile of dead people. And the 19th, well, there was of it, still had to get home, and if the weird voice magic could reach as far as the tree line, then they'd have to go miles out of their way to get home, and that would undoubtedly lead them into trouble with somebody who wasn't nearly as nice as Sings to Trees. "We need to get a better look. Murray, you and me. Blanchett, stay here. Sarge." It was a poor day when Blanchett was questioning orders, Nasilka thought grimly. "Still, you're the only one we know is immune. So you're the only one who can get a message back if it gets us. If it's a kid, fine. If it's a grown-up wizard, well, we'll find out." Blanchett hunched his shoulders and looked mulish. But perhaps the bear had a word with him, because he said gloomily, "If you say so, Sarge." She took one final look at the church and the bodies, shoved her earplugs back in, Murray did the same, and made a move-out gesture with her fingers. Nasilka and Murray moved out.
Take a deep breath, everybody. That chapter was kind of intense.
You know what I'd really like to see Ursula do? Really like to see her do military horror, because she's very good at it.
Yeah.
Murray remains my boy.
Murray is my absolute
Although the bear says that feels like kind of a load, Sarge. Maybe the best line in the novella.
Exactly. War is Hell, Goblin Edition. Yeah, I'd read it. Absolutely, I'd read it.
No gobs, no masters. 17. Sings to Trees stood just inside the forest, and Sings to Trees fretted. He'd lost sight of the goblins fairly quickly. For all their apparent clumsiness, they knew their way around a hedgerow. He hoped they'd be okay. I couldn't believe he'd nearly attacked the Ceridian. He should go back to the farm and send a pigeon. He should send a pigeon about the mage and about the weird noise. The goblins would be fine. The goblins could take care of themselves. He wrung his hands together. The goblins could probably take care of themselves, better than Sings himself could. It was so quiet. The quiet bothered him almost as much as the memory of the voice, truth be told. Forest edges were hopping with life, birds and bugs, lizards and squirrels. There should be scurrying and scuttling and chirping and singing. There should be something stamped. He turned his head slowly, already knowing what he would see. Ah. Yes. The empty eyes of the Ceridian stag stared back at him. I won't go out there, he told the stag. It's okay. The stag rattled and stamped again. Is there something else? He looked for the bone doe, but she wasn't there. Perhaps the stag had seen her somewhere safe, then returned. The stag paced towards him. Sings held his ground. I almost attacked him. He didn't attack me, and he didn't hurt that goblin, even though he could have. If anything, he's got the moral high ground on me in this situation. A few feet away, the Ceridian halted. Hollow eyes gazed into his. And then the stag turned slightly, stretched out a forelimb, and knelt. Why is he... Oh, no. No, Sings the Tree said out loud. Oh, no. Right, you cannot be serious. The stag rattled with impatience. Sings the Trees eyed the exposed knobs of the stag's backbone and imagined them against his tender bits. He shuddered. Are you sure I can't just follow you? The stag rattled again and pawed at the ground. Oh, but you're back. Oh, dear. Sings the Trees was not any more fond of pain than any elf, but he had chosen a life that involved a certain degree of personal discomfort. It appeared that this was going to involve more of the same. He looked at the stag's backbone again. Very personal discomfort. He saved us before. I healed his mate. He clearly knows more about the magic that's going on than I do. Oh dear. Half a moment, said Sings to Trees. He stripped off his tunic and began packing grass and moss into it. There was no putting a saddle on a Ceridian, but perhaps he could manage some slight protection between himself and the jut of the stag's vertebrae. The Ceridian waited. Sings to Trees finished stuffing his makeshift pillow, took a deep breath, and prepared to ride the bone stag into the unknown.
Tonight's gender, ride the bone stag.
The village square felt agonizingly exposed. The goblins clung to the shadow of the buildings as long as they could, and then there was a water trough for horses partway there, but after that there was nothing to hide behind. Except bodies. It was not the first time in Nasilka's life she'd hidden behind bodies, but if the great gibbering gods were kind, it would be the last. She thought the smell might follow her for several lifetimes. She and Murray crouched behind the cow. It was bloated and its tongue was sticking out and its udder had puffed up like a balloon. She'd never given much thought to what happened to a cow's udder when it rotted. She wished she wasn't giving it any thought now. Murray jerked his chin at the door. It was still slightly ajar, and there was no cover between them and it unless you counted the dead steer blocking the other door. They could hide behind the open one, but there were bodies there, and they'd actually have to climb on them and just no. The dead steer was going to have to be. She flicked her fingers. Go in, cover me. That last dash across the open square made her nerves jangle like badly tuned bells. Goblin feet were large and flat, and actually fairly good for stealth if you moved carefully and didn't let them go slap, slap, slap. But there were patches of mud. Let's go with mud. Red mud. Yeah, that's right. She had to be careful not to squelch. And how was Murray going to cover her anyway? Throw a dead body at someone who attacked her? She fetched up behind the dead steer and waited with her heart in her throat. Nothing happened. Flies buzzed around her in a cloud, but no strange voice called out. Nobody came to see what was going on or to scream, because there was a goblin warrior in town. Oh, this would be a really, really bad time for the rangers to show up. 30-odd dead bodies and 3 live goblins, and no, that did not bear thinking about. Murray crossed the square, dropped down beside her. They exchanged glances, then looked at the gap in the door. It was about 6 inches wide and yawned like a chasm between them. She flicked a finger at Murray. Wait, and sidled to the edge of the door. It was dark inside. The bright sunlight made hot bars of light across the shadows, illuminating the edge of a pew. She crouched low, squinting. It was hard to see anything. Well, no help for it. She took out an earplug. There was a faint sizzling sound. It was a familiar enough sound, but so far out of normal context that she couldn't place it. The smell of the dead was overwhelming, but under it, Nasilka could smell pancakes. She could make out a shape at the far end of the gloom, backlit by the remains of a fire, and in front of the embers, humming, was the human subadult, and it was frying pancakes. Goblins were occasionally bad. Goblins were scourges of the night. War was war. After a battle, you generally ate like a starving wolf, although you couldn't always keep it down afterwards. But even goblins didn't stand in buildings surrounded by the piled dead and make pancakes. She felt a brief, blinding rage. Humans might be the enemy, but these were civilians, goddammit! And then the rage died away and was replaced with a deep, unsettled disquiet. Because anybody who would do that was crazy. Bad bug shit crazy, deep down crazy. People like that had an animal in their head, and you could see it gnawing at the back of their eyes when they talked. And they were very, very dangerous, because there was absolutely no telling what they would do next. She didn't look back at Murray. Her eyes would have to adjust again if she did. She couldn't sign what she was seeing. Goblin hand sign did not include things like crazy child making pancakes. She gritted her teeth and slipped inside. The door didn't quite creak when she pushed it open, but it did let in more light, and if the human looked up, it was bound to see the difference. Nasilka dropped low behind the first pew, breathing silently through her mouth, listening. There was no change in the humming. It was a tuneless little repetition. No particular order. Why don't I have a crossbow? I could shoot it from here and save us all the trouble. She should have borrowed one from Singster Trees. Surely he had one for dealing with something. Rabid foxes or rogue deer or whatnot. She crept the length of the pew, shot another look at the fire. It appeared to be made out of broken chairs and cushions from the pews, and looked for the human. It had moved a foot or two to one side and was fumbling with something on the ground. Probably wants syrup on its pancakes, she thought darkly. She took the chance, scurried to the next pew, and then she heard a quiet glug and had a hysterical urge to laugh, because that was exactly the sound of somebody pouring out syrup. The tuneless humming stopped and was replaced by the scrape of fork on plate and the sound of chewing. Nasilka doubted she would have been able to hear either if the town had not been so deadly silent. Did she dare risk another pew? She just decided to go down the length of the pew to the far end and use that concealment to move forward when she heard the door creak. It was louder this time, and damn it, Murray still had his earplugs in, so of course he didn't hear it. And if they got out of this alive, she was going to box his ears. The eating noises stopped. "Hello," said a voice shockingly close. Cloth rustled as the human stood up. "Is someone there?" She stood up. If the human fixed on her, maybe it would overlook Murray. It was standing less than 5 feet away. It still had a fork and a plate of pancakes in its hand. Blonde hair poked out from under the cloth on its head, and she stared at Sergeant Nasilka with wide, blue eyes. Said Nasilka. "Hi." We'll leave it there for tonight.
Are you really going to leave it there for tonight?
Well, that was where we planned to leave it.
Yes, it is. All right, everybody. We're going to take a quick break, get a stretch, breathe,
Dun, dun,
swear
fucking done.
until next week, and we'll be back shortly.